All right, so welcome, guys, to our last episode or part of the Great Depression and the New Deal. We've been going through this and we are almost to the end, so stick with us and we'll be done here shortly. These are two big questions. We'll deal with these at the end rather than now, so more about that later. And a quick reminder, we're talking about FDR's New Deal programs, in particular, part two, which we'll get into now in just a second. This is kind of a preview of where we're going and where we're heading today in today's topic and section. So, like I said, we'll talk more about this as we go through it. So, first, we'll talk the election of 1936. If you're president, you got to keep your job every 4 years, and FDR certainly does. In 1936, he is elected with winning the majority of all states except for two, a little old Maine and Vermont. So certainly the nation spoke with the electoral vote. The popular vote was a little closer, but certainly still a pretty big one. And this is seen as people supporting the New Deal and FDR pretty significantly. And that is because he promises these 3 R's again: relief, recovery, and reform, right? But this is the second New Deal, and this is going to be different than the first New Deal. But a lot of the similarities will continue. The most significant one, certainly not the piece of legislation that came out first, but was the Social Security Act. And this is the most important achievement, I would say, of the New Deal. Took a lot of wrangling, and people didn't necessarily, in the beginning of the Depression, assume that the government was going to take an action that they did, like Social Security, where they would guarantee that if you retired, if you paid into the system, that you'd get some compensation. That if you were unemployed, the government might give you money until you got a new job, and they might aid families with dependent children or those who were disabled. This is really a big step in the government, and this really represents kind of all 3 R's, right? Relief for those who are unemployed, recovery for those who are retired, and I suppose relief again for those with kids. And so this really is, and reform, because it changes the whole name of the game, that the government is going to assist you if you have difficult circumstances. So, and the most important thing about Social Security is it's still around today, that the New Deal legacy lives on in Social Security. It's a difficult program now simply because of the funding, which maybe we'll talk more about if you guys have questions in class. But got to move on to the next one. And that is the National Relations Board. Essentially, the government had sided with business pretty clearly for most of the nation's history, but in particular during industrialization, and then there was some kind of back and forth during the Progressive era. But during the New Deal, the government sides, or at least begins to support workers in a degree that they hadn't before, and in particular unions. They recognize unions' abilities to collectively organize or basically become unions, and that really represents stronger government support of workers or labor. And now the government is going to be the middleman or the moderator between companies and workers. So once again, the NLRB is still around today, kind of creating deals if none is to be had between companies and workers. Another one, we talked about this previously, but the Works Progress Administration becomes probably the most famous program to come out of the New Deal as far as working and workers are concerned. They produce a lot of long-term and kind of legacy sort of projects, but also day-to-day stuff. But their biggest thing was, relief, right? They wanted to give people jobs, and there's some success there. Although critics would point out, and accurately to some degree, that there is a bump up again in unemployment here. I'm probably starting in 37 and up to, I don't know, maybe 38, and then there's a decline again. So certainly nothing is perfect in life, and the WPA was not, but it does go down, right? Moving on, another thing is the minimum wage. This was a hotly debated topic, but that should workers be given a minimum wage, right? Critics would argue that companies and workers should figure that out themselves, and the government shouldn't get involved with that. But in 1938, they decide, and they say that most workers should get paid 25 cents an hour. Now, that's not all workers. Some groups or categories of workers were excluded or exempted, is another phrase. But so, for example, like domestic workers, or today, another good example is waiters and waitresses don't have to make minimum wage if they're getting tips. And so you can see kind of the up and down of minimum wage in relation to $1968. This is one of the few graphs that I could find that was decent, and they're actually talking about upping the minimum wage again. So we'll see about that. Maybe a benefit to all you part-time workers out there. Okay, moving on. And I do have to take a side note and say I am sorry. If I sound funny or I'm sniffling, that's because I'm sick right now. So hopefully I'll be on the mend. But back onto the New Deal, and more important things, the second New Deal, is the Rural Electrification Act. Is a law that's passed, and really the goal is to connect the country or the rural areas of our nation with electricity. And this doesn't seem all that maybe big or grand, but it was really important, I would say. This is, I would say, one of the more significant parts of the New Deal, simply because it gives people a really tangible benefit of being connected to essentially the power source that allows for modern life. And so millions of rural Americans receive this. And the reason I think it's also important is because private business was not going to do this, it looked like, anytime soon. It cost a lot of money, and you weren't going to recover that money anytime soon. If any of you live out in the country, you can kind of get this experience with internet still. Certain companies are slow to get out internet because they don't get as many customers, and they have to go out further to get those fewer customers. So, Rural Electrification Act. This is more of an idea or a philosophy than in particular an act, and that is this guy John Maynard Keynes, and he comes up with a new strategy for the good old government, and he says that we should use deficit spending, which was controversial at the time and still certainly debatable today, and that is the government spends more money than it takes in and carries debt. So this is nothing new for modern people because our country has significant debt now, and every year we spend more than we take in, but at the time it was very uncontroversial. This is in part what Hoover was resisting with what people would call doing nothing during the early recession. He didn't want a deficit. And so to look at it a little bit more clearly, we can see the government did have a little deficit here before World War I, but certainly that jumps up as we pay for the war, and then we're paying it down as our allies pay us back, and then we have the Depression, and that goes up, and then it skyrockets in World War II. The most debt we've ever had as a nation in relation to GDP, not as far as total dollars, and then it goes kind of down, and now we're going back up at levels higher than the Great Depression here in 2009, according to the Congressional Budget Office. And then there's predictions about the future, but essentially this is tied to GDP, which is gross domestic product, which is how much money the country makes in a year. All things, haircuts and sales at every store counter in America. So at the peak of World War II, we spent more money than the entire nation made in 1 year. But then those rates go down, after that. Moving on, the Supreme Court was another area of challenge for the New Deal, and in particular because the Supreme Court was conservative in relation to FDR, and these two Supreme Court cases cut down some major legislation in the New Deal, and FDR wants to stop this because he thinks this is important to help the people, and the Supreme Court thinks this is important to preserve basic limitations of the government. But FDR determines that the best course of action is to raise the Supreme Court justices, the people on the court, from 9 to 15. And he would appoint the rest. So essentially he would create a lopsided court in favor of his ideas. And this was what's called court packing. It was really unpopular. This becomes kind of a black eye on his otherwise really popular presidency during the New Deal, and essentially because he's clearly violating checks and balances. So we can see a political cartoon kind of describing this process, right? Washington in the background and Roosevelt's the player arguing with the ump. And here we see a bunch of strikeouts as far as New Deal legislation. There are critics both on the left and the right. I should have actually reversed these. But on the left, we have Huey Long, who held probably more liberal ideas than FDR, really advocating a lot more government interaction. In fact, he says, give me the power of a dictator and I can make the Depression go away, which is pretty dangerous business. And then on the right, we have Father Conglin really criticizing the president from a conservative standpoint. Additionally, we have some other changes. Eleanor Roosevelt becomes a huge ally and an important player in the Roosevelt administration. She becomes kind of the hands and eyes of the administration, traveling around the country and really being a representative of the New Deal and FDR, and is really a savvy kind of political agent, although she's the first lady. And that typically, those two things didn't always go together, but Mrs. Roosevelt certainly kind of breaks the mold. Speaking of breaking the mold, Frances Perkin becomes the first woman in cabinet position for the federal government. A huge change, as it was an all-boys club up to then. And then additionally, FDR consulted what was called collectively the Black Cabinet, but essentially African-American leaders who would speak to FDR about issues pertaining to that segment of the population. There are kind of mixed messages when it comes to race in the New Deal. In particular, FDR had to do a lot of political deals with politicians who essentially were racist or elected by people who preferred not to have racial integration. And so a lot of New Deal programs would limit African Americans and where they could work or what jobs or how much they could get paid. And so there was significant discrimination in New Deal policies, which is, once again, kind of a downside of the New Deal. And so short-term and long-term is, I think short-term is much more easy to talk about than long-term, which we'll talk more about in class. But short-term, FDR is seen as getting the country out of this slump. Now, I would say, at least in my analysis, that the New Deal is an experiment. The government has never done this before, and so anytime you experiment, there's probably going to be successes and failures, and we could point to a lot of new programs on either end, and so a lot in the middle with the New Deal. Long term, though, people begin to question the New Deal and its policies and its effectiveness, and so historians and even common day people begin to dispute, right, the legacy of FDR, in particular the New Deal here in '82, and even today. It's become kind of this political football. So, but more about that in class. Additionally, other things that really happen that are long-term that are really not political is, one, the government begins to regulate the economy, becomes a pretty active part in that. Two, that people are given direct relief from the government from that time on, and also the government is going to go into debt in their spending. So three significant things I would say that are just kind of expectations of the government today. This is a review of all the important terms and topics we talked about. And lastly, these are our two big questions, right? What's the relationship between the people and the government, and how did it change, and why didn't it always work? These are two big questions that I want you to be able to answer on your own. Guys, that is it. I'll see you in class. Have a good one.